Marco qui arrive.
So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm from France and from INRIA in Grenoble, and I'll be sharing this committee, and very pleased to do so. So I will quickly introduce the other jury members. So we have two reviewers. So Professor Jan Dryden from University of Nottingham, who's here. Professor Pierre-Antoine Absil, who's online. Do you hear us well? Yeah.
Yes, it's working. Excellent.
And then online, we also have Professor Frédéric Pascal from Central Supélec. Do you hear us? Yes. Professor Armin Schwartzman from UC San Diego.
Here, all right.
And then we have the Xavier Pennec, Director of Research here, the supervisor, and Professor Chalbourg-Guéron from here too, as a guest, and Pierre-Alexandre Mattei from INRIA here too, and chargé de recherche as a guest too. So thanks all for being here, and Tom will be, it's your turn for 45 minutes. And maybe just a word after that, other jury members will ask questions. So I will explain it again later.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Dear audience, dear member of the jury, good afternoon in this sunny Antipolis. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to present you my PhD thesis, Rethinking Statistical Methods with Flags, under the supervision of Xavier Pennec. Okay. So to give you the big picture, this is a flag. It's a sequence of nested subspaces of increasing dimension. Equivalently, it can be defined as a sequence of mutually orthogonal subspaces. So I admit, for now, it might look a little bit arcane or uninviting, but the goal for me today will be to convince you that these exotic objects called flags are actually truly important in statistics. And so this will be notably justified by the fact that these flags, they are hidden in many statistical methods, including principal component analysis, which is a central statistical method. And so there will be natural geometric objects for interpreting those statistical methods. Let me give a little bit more motivations. Imagine you have some data living in dimension P. For instance, you have an MR image with a P equal 1 million pixels. Then it's classical to assume that this data lies close to a lower dimensional subspace, notably because it could be summarized with a low number of features of interest. And so if I introduce these two following sets, the Grassmannian, which is a space of all linear subspaces of a given dimension, and related to this space, the Stiefel manifold, which is a space of all orthonormal bases of a given dimension. It means that when you want to fit a subspace to your data, so to represent your data in a low dimensional space, you will end up doing optimization of a certain criterion on Grassmannians or Stiefel manifolds. This is classical linear dimensionality reductions and statistical methods beyond. So let me start with an example. You have a principal component analysis, PCA, which is a ubiquitous method in statistics. It is mostly known under its dimensionality reduction formulation, where you have some data and you look for a low dimensional subspace that minimizes the average Euclidean distance to the data. And it is known that the solution to this optimization problem is given by doing the eigen decomposition of the sample covariance matrix. You take the vectors associated with the largest eigenvalues. They are called the principal components, and together they span a subspace which is used for dimensionality reduction. What is less known is that the principal components are also used for exploratory data analysis. They can be interpreted as the main mode of variation in your data, and this is well described in the reference book by Jan Joliffe. We have plenty of other methods. For instance, imagine you have an outlier. Then your subspace will be influenced by this outlier. So if you want outlier robust subspaces, you can instead minimize more robust criteria, which is the case of robust subspace recovery. You have plenty of other methods. Imagine you have high dimensional data with several classes, like dogs and cats, for instance, and you want first to reduce the dimensionality before fitting a classification algorithm. Then what you will do, if you do PCA, usually it will be a bad idea because some clusters might end up being mixed. So what you do, you have, for instance, linear discriminant analysis, where you look for a subspace, which at the same time minimizes the within cluster variance, and at the same time maximizes the inter-cluster variance, so that you have well-spread cluster between themselves, but concentrated on themselves. You have plenty of other methods, spectral clustering, matrix completion, and so on and so forth. This was for the subspace part. For the component part involving optimization on Stiefel manifolds, you have plenty of other methods like independent component analysis, spectral shape analysis. And in this case, it's really the components individually that we want to estimate well because they will be used for statistical analysis. For instance, when you have shape data and you compare the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian. Okay, so now assume that you have a data set that has been sampled from a Gaussian density with multiple eigenvalues, in the sense that some eigenvalues of the covariance matrix have multiplicities greater than 1. It means that the associated eigenvectors will be rotation invariant, in the sense that they will span a whole multidimensional eigenspace, as illustrated on the figure on the right. This means that the associated principal components will suffer from a large intersample variability, which is a pitfall for data interpretability because, as I said earlier, these components are often interpreted individually. We call this issue the curse of isotropy. Now you may have a legitimate question, which would be, why should we make such an assumption that our data comes from a data set that is a Gaussian distribution with multiple covariance eigenvalues? For the Gaussian assumption, it's pretty classical in statistics in virtue of central limit theorems and entropy maximizing properties of Gaussians. It's more the multiple eigenvalue assumption, which is more curious. And for that, we'll invoke the law of parsimony, also known as Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best one. What we are about to see in the next sections is that a Gaussian model with multiple eigenvalues, which is parameterized with flags, is simpler in the sense that it has less parameters than a Gaussian model with distinct eigenvalues. Okay, this was the first issue. Second issue that we call the nestedness issue is that in general, in practice on real data, you don't know the intrinsic dimension of your data. And it's not even evident if there is a unique intrinsic dimension. So what people do usually is trying several dimensions. And the issue is that in general, when you try different dimensions, the subspaces output by your subspace method won't be nested in the sense that the smallest one won't be included in the largest one, which raises an important issue of consistency between your data representations at different dimensions. Okay, so I gave a few motivations for the interest of flags in statistics. Now we are about, I'm going to give a little bit more background on flag manifolds, how its geometry and how to do optimization on such spaces. This will enable us to go to the main conceptual contribution of the thesis, which is how to address this curse of isotropy phenomenon that I raised previously. And it will naturally call us to transition from unstable principal components to more stable principal subspaces. Then we'll explore more quantitative methods for the choice of the subspaces dimensions. Then we will extend our methodology beyond Gaussians by looking at Gaussian mixtures. And then we'll go even beyond Gaussian models. And at the same time, answer the question of the nestedness issue between subspace representations. And then I will conclude. Okay, so let us start with a little bit of prerequisite on flag manifolds. A flag, it is a sequence of nested linear subspaces of increasing dimension. The sequence of dimensions of the flag is called the signature of the flag. So here we have a flag of signature 1, 2, 3. It's a 1D subspace included in a 2D subspace included in a 3D space. Equivalently, a flag can be defined as a sequence of mutually orthogonal subspaces. You can do that by taking orthogonal complements. And then, in this case, the sequence of incremental dimensions is called the type of the flag. So here we have exactly the same flag as before, but represented as a flag of type 1, 1, 1. And there is already an important example of flag under this definition, which are the eigenspaces of a symmetric matrix, because they will form a flag of mutually orthogonal subspaces whose type is a sequence of eigenvalue multiplicities of your symmetric matrix. Okay, so for now, it might look a little bit abstract. You might be wondering how to do computations on these spaces, and it actually happens that a flag can be represented as a matrix, more precisely as an orthogonal matrix, because if you take an orthonormal basis of each of your mutually orthogonal subspaces and you concatenate them, then you get a representation with an orthogonal matrix of your flag. The issue is that you have several possible choices of orthonormal basis for each subspace. Instead of this Q2 vertical, you could have taken the opposite one. You could have taken any rotation of Q1 within the subspace it spans. So in the end, in more technical terms, flags are equivalence classes of orthogonal matrices. In even more technical terms, the set of flags of a given type is a smooth Riemannian manifold with a quotient structure. It is a quotient of the orthogonal group by some orthogonal subgroups. It might look a bit harsh for non-geometers, but what you have to retain is that you can inherit many properties from the orthogonal group, which is already very well characterized. And another interesting feature is that we can notice that these flags manifolds, they somewhat generalize Grassmannians and Stiefel manifolds. So in the end, when we will set up some limitations of current statistical methods with Grassmannians and Stiefel manifold, we can see them as particular cases of a much larger set of models, which will be parameterized with flags. Okay. One important tool in geometric statistics are geodesic distances. They enable to compute distances between two objects, to compare them, to interpolate between them. So they are fundamental tools in statistics with plenty of applications. And so the first contribution we had was to propose a simple algorithm for approximating the geodesic distance on flag manifolds, because it is not explicit in these cases. So I won't detail because it's a bit technical, but I will summarize it with illustrations. You have to imagine that you have two vertical walls and you want to align the points on the walls. So in this case, by aligning, I mean minimizing the distance between the 2 points within their space. And in this case, you see that you just need to put them at the same height, they will be aligned. Now you have to imagine in our problem that actually the walls are curved and the distances between the points are not straight lines, but something looking more like that. So which is a geodesic distance between two orthonormal bases. So actually, it might look a bit beautiful, but it makes the problem much complicated. And so the idea we had was to relax this alignment problem using the extrinsic, so the Euclidean distance. And it happens that this problem has a closed form solution, so we can use it as a building block for an iterative algorithm to approximate the geodesic distance. And so this leads to drastic improvements in accuracy, speed, and radius of convergence with respect to previous state of the art. And the last step of the prerequisite is how to do optimization on flag manifolds. You have to imagine that you have a function on a sphere, for instance, and you want to find its minimum. Then you cannot do a classical gradient descent because it would make your iterates go out of the space. So we have to replace that with what we call a Riemannian gradient and a retraction, and this will enable to give a sequence of iterates that stays on the manifold and enjoys some convergence guarantees. Okay. This is now the time to introduce the main contribution of the thesis from a conceptual point of view, which is a principal subspace analysis, which tries to address this curse of isotropy phenomenon that I raised in introduction, which makes the components really unstable. So our principal subspace analysis models are Gaussian models, where we impose a constraint on the multiplicities of the eigenvalues. The sequence of multiplicities of the eigenvalues is called the type of the PSA model. So here we have a PSA model of type 2, 2, 4, 7. Okay, how to estimate the parameters when you have a given data? You can do maximum likelihood estimation, and it tells us simply to compute the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of your sample covariance matrix, and then to block average the eigenvalues according to the desired multiplicities, to the desired type gamma. And for those who might know it, our PSA is actually a generalization of the probabilistic PCA from Tipping and Bishop. I could tell much more in the question if you're interested. Okay. now let's do a little bit of geometry. What is the geometry of the parameter space? We have a Gaussian. So a Gaussian, you have the mean and the covariance matrix. The mean vector, let's say it lives in a Euclidean space of dimension p. And for the covariance, you have the eigenvalues. So if we say we have d distinct eigenvalues and we impose an ordering, they will live on a monotone cone. And most important, the associated eigenspace, they will live on a flag manifold whose type is precisely the type of the PSA model. So it's gamma. So if we concatenate all of that, we can compute the dimension of the parameter space. And what is really interesting is that we see that the number of covariance parameters decrease quadratically with the multiplicities of the eigenvalues. So we are tempted to equalize the most eigenvalues possible as long as it fits quite well your data distribution. And if we want to do that a little bit more rigorously, we will optimize a criterion on the space of all possible multiplicities, which makes a trade-off between the likelihood and the parsimony. For that, you have, for instance, the BIC, Bayesian information criterion. And so we'll optimize this criterion over the set to determine the most likely, let's say, multiplicities of your eigenvalues. The issue is that the number of candidate models is 2 to the power of the dimension. So it's totally intractable. Even if you're in dimension 10 or 20, it's already totally impossible to do that. So we have to resort to some tricks to try to select the eigenvalue multiplicities. We started to build intuition with a particular case. The question was, when should 2 adjacent eigenvalues be assumed to be equal? And we managed to find an answer to this question, and this may be the key message you should retain about this talk. It is that 2 adjacent eigenvalues should be assumed equal when their relative distance is lower than a certain threshold, which depends on the number of samples. Similarly, I can tell you much more about this threshold in the question if you want. But if we want to do a little application, little practical case, imagine you have 1,000 samples, then all the eigenvalue pairs whose relative distance is lower than 21%, they should be assumed equal. Or in other words, if you have an eigenvalue of 1 and an eigenvalue of 0.8, you need at least 1,000 samples to distinguish them. And this is rarely the case in practice, as we try to do it on some classical real data sets. So this means that there is a curse of isotropies that is much more present than expected, and we should take it into account when conducting analysis on principal components. Okay, so to summarize the methodology, we have some data, we do the eigen decomposition of the sample covariance matrix, then we equalize the eigenvalues whose relative distance is below a certain threshold. And then the issue is that now we have not anymore principal components, but principal subspaces associated with these multiple eigenvalues. So you might wonder which interpretation should we give to such principal subspaces. A basic idea is that a subspace is nothing but a collection of vectors. So we can basically sample from the subspace and try to interpret the individual points we get in this subspace. Or more quantitatively, you can try to optimize an interpretability-related criterion, like Varimax, entropy, or independent component analysis, and optimize that within the subspace by finding the optimal rotation of the principal components. We did plenty of experiments in the manuscript. I will maybe just describe one, which is the one on the right for short. We have data which consists in linear combination of Laplacian eigenmodes on a square domain. And it happens that when we have closed eigenvalues, the associated principal components are usually kind of linear combinations of the original Laplacian eigenmode. They are sometimes called quasi-mode. And so if we do an independent component analysis in the subspace they span, then we'll get the original Laplacian eigenmode, like here and here. Okay. This was all for the curse of isotropy. So as I said earlier, we studied a particular case of a much more complicated problem, which is intractable. And now we'll try to have more quantitative methodologies for the choice of the eigenvalue multiplicities. Let us start with a first methodology. So to summarize what we had before, we wanted to optimize this criterion onto the space of all possible multiplicities, which is very large. So it's a discrete optimization problem. A natural idea might be to make this discrete problem continuous. But the question is, how should we relax the discrete penalty on the number of parameters of your model? It's not evident at first sight. And so for that, we have a nice result, which exactly writes the number of covariance parameters as an L0 norm of the spectral gaps in your covariance matrix. I have the discrete formula on the top, you can compare them. But basically, once we have that, we can classically relax this L0 norm with L1 norms, as it will induce sparsity. And what we observe when we look at the negative gradient of the penalty, which will tell you how your iterates will be attracted, we can see that the eigenvalues get somewhat mutually attracted, which is exactly what we want in order to induce parsimony by equalizing eigenvalues. And the good news is also that we can further simplify the problem under the Gaussian assumption because we have a closed form solution for the flag part. So there just remains the eigenvalue part. And the eigenvalues, they have an ordering constraint, so they live on something called the monotone cone, as I said earlier. And so we'll do a projected gradient descent to optimize our problem of covariance estimation. So basically, we initialize our profile with the sample eigenvalues, and then we iterate steps of projected gradient descent, where we do a Euclidean gradient step, and then we project it onto the constraint set that is the monotone cone. Okay, might look a little bit technical. I will do an illustration. On the left, it's a monotone cone, so it's our constraint set in white. And we don't want to go to the gray zone, because this is where our eigenvalues will violate the ordering constraints that we wanted. But as I said earlier, the eigenvalues are mutually attracted, so the gradient makes us want to go in this gray zone. So after a Euclidean gradient step, we have a profile like that, which is unordered, and we need to project it into the constraint set again. And what is really nice is that this projection step, which usually is quite costly, in our case, it's exactly the problem of isotonic regression. And we have a linear time algorithm for solving that. And it boils down to equalizing the eigenvalues, which violates the ordering constraints. So this isotonic regression, it automatically brings parsimony into your covariance. So it's exactly what we wanted. Let's do a simulation. Imagine you have data sampled from a Gaussian distribution with unknown covariance matrix. I know it's the covariance matrix, but I won't tell you for now. So these are the sample eigenvalues. This is what you observe in practice. This is how we initialize our algorithm. On the left, it is the loss we want to optimize. I will run a GIF. Okay, so we observe that the loss decreases along the iterations, and our eigenvalues, they get little by little equalized. So we end up with this two-step profile, which is quite different from the original profile, right? And if we compare it to the Lodois-Wolff estimator, which is like a baseline covariance estimator in high dimensions, it tells pretty another story. It's much closer to the sample eigenvalues. So which one is right? Suspense, suspense. It is ours. And so it is actually very nice because we started from this problem of detecting the curse of isotropy. And by relaxing it, we ended up with a fast covariance estimator in high dimensions, which outperforms some other baseline covariance estimators on some settings that are deemed by Lodois and Wolff themselves to be very challenging. So it's a nice result. Okay, this was the first heuristic. Let us see another family of heuristics for selecting the eigenvalue multiplicities. For instance, we can use discrete heuristics, where instead of doing model selection on the whole set of eigenvalue multiplicities, we select first a subset of much reasonable size, and we optimize the BIC on this set. So this set you can generate it by running a hierarchical clustering of the sample eigenvalues, for instance. It will lead to a hierarchical family with decreasing complexity. You can also generate it by putting a prior on the number of distinct eigenvalues. And in both cases, we manage to find a strong asymptotic consistency result in the sense that almost surely, when the number of samples is large enough, our two heuristics will select the true model. Okay. And the third heuristic it is that up until now, most of our results have been based on the Bayesian information criterion, which is actually an asymptotic approximation of a very important quantity in Bayesian statistics, which is the Bayesian model evidence, or the marginal likelihood. So it's a very complicated integral, which is why the BIC makes a lot of approximations to it. And the idea is that we would like to refine this approximation in the similar fashion as the work of Thomas Minka, which is a seminal work called the Automatic Choice of Dimensionality in PCA, and which is now the default choice for the dimension in scikit-learn, which is a very classical library for data science. So it's an important paper, and we draw from it to refine our approximation. We introduce a prior on the parameters, which is somewhat uniform for the mean and for the flag of eigenspaces, and scale inverse chi-squared for the eigenvalues. Then we perform a Laplace approximation of this integral, which is nothing but a second-order Taylor expansion of the posterior distribution around the maximum a posteriori. And we end up with a very complicated formula, but actually the only thing we have to do is implement it, and then you can readily use it for your model selection. And of course, we have done it. So in summary, we have this Minka, the extension of Minka's criterion, which improves both model selection accuracy and uncertainty with respect to the BIC. We can see this kind of phase transition between the small sample, small eigengap regime and the large N delta regime, where the accuracy goes from 0 to 100%. And the frontier is much below the one of the BIC, meaning that the model selection accuracy for the MIC is better than the BIC in some intermediate regimes. And also, our criterion better handles model selection uncertainty in the sense that the BIC often tends to select underparameterized models with high confidence, while ours will better balance the posterior probabilities between the model it hesitates on. Okay. Up until now, everything we have done was based on the Gaussian assumption. And as you might know it, in real dataset, usually you have several classes. So Gaussian models are a nice second-order approximation, but they won't fit flexibly real datasets. So we'll extend our work to Gaussian mixtures. So Gaussian mixture models, they are really ubiquitous in statistical learning, notably because they are very good universal approximators for densities, and also because they give a probabilistic nature to many machine learning algorithms. So they have really this advantage. And the two classical GMMs are the full Gaussian mixture model, where each cluster is a multivariate Gaussian density with a full covariance matrix. So this will be clearly overparameterized in high dimensions. So in contrast, what people usually do to have very parsimonious models is that they will consider spherical GMMs, where each class is spherical, so it's kind of a probabilistic version of the k-means clustering algorithm. And the issue is that, of course, these spherical GMMs, they will have an issue with anisotropic clusters. They will badly fit them. So we would like to find a trade-off between the likelihood of the full GMM and the parsimony of the spherical GMM. And now you might be seeing where we are going to go, because the full eigenvalues are almost surely distinct, the spherical eigenvalues are all equal, and we will find a trade-off by looking at piecewise constant signals. So we introduce our mixtures of PSA, which are nothing but convex combinations of PSA model, where the eigenvalue multiplicities are pre-specified in advance. And so if they are pre-specified, we can run a classical expectation maximization algorithm. It alternates between two steps. The first step consists in computing the probability that each point belongs to a given class. And the maximization step, when we solve it for our case, it tells us to compute the responsibility-weighted covariance matrices for each cluster, and then to block average the eigenvalues according to the desired multiplicities. Okay, now you might again see where we are going to go, because if we pre-specify the eigenvalue multiplicities, it means that we need to run one EM for each set of candidate model. And in our case, we have 2 to the power of the dimension to the power of the number of clusters candidate model. So it's totally impossible in practice. What we would like to do is instead a joint inference of the parameters and the hyperparameters that are the eigenvalue multiplicities. What we would like to do would be ideally to replace the maximization step with some sort of component-wise model selection meaning that we would use what we presented in the previous sections for each cluster. And what is nice is that we get the result that if we do that well, then we can guarantee the theoretical monotonicity of the objective function along the iteration of our variant of the OM algorithm. We call this one the component-wise penalized OM. And this has plenty of applications. For the classical ones are density estimation, classification, and clustering. Maybe a more original one is the one, the application to single image denoising, which is drawn from the paper of Udar and co-authors. You have to imagine that you have a noisy image. You will cut it into overlapping patches. Then you will flatten them. It will make a data set in dimension s square, where s is the size of the patch. Then you can fit to that a mixture of PSA model, where you impose the constraint that there is a common noise, which is a constraint on the eigenvalues. Then you can denoise each patch by computing a conditional expectation, and you end up with a denoiser. And actually, it gives a nice partial signal-to-noise ratio, so denoising matrix, quite similar to the one of Udar et al., but much faster because we do not need to tune any hyperparameter, and also with much fewer parameters because we equalize more eigenvalues. Okay, and now let us go to the final extension, which is the one beyond Gaussian models. If you remember what I told in the introduction, you have this issue in subspace methods that when you run subspace optimization problems at different dimensions, in general, they won't be nested, which raises an important issue of consistency. The sole exception to that is principal component analysis, where we know that almost surely the optimal subspaces at different dimensions will be nested. So we can base on this result to try to reformulate PCA as an optimization problem on flag manifolds. And so the trick we introduce to do that we call the flag trick, is to replace the orthogonal projection matrix with some kind of weighted average of nested projectors. And so this is a very generic trick, which we can apply to any subspace method, actually. And then we run optimization on flag manifolds with the algorithm I introduced in section 2. I won't detail all the applications, they are in the manuscript, but we did applications in robust subspace recovery, linear discriminant analysis, spectral clustering, and much more fields. Okay, now this is time to conclude. So we first gave the main motivations for using flags in statistics. There is this curse of isotropy in principal component analysis, which makes the components unstable. We have this nestedness issue in subspace learning. Then we introduced main tools for doing geometry and optimization on flag manifolds, and we proposed an efficient algorithm for computing the geodesic distance on flag manifolds. Then we could go to the main conceptual contribution of the thesis, which is principal subspace analysis, which is parameterized with flag manifolds, and it tells us to block average eigenvalues whose relative distance is below a certain threshold. Then we explore much more quantitative methods for the choice of the subspace's dimensions, a continuous relaxation, some discrete heuristics, and a Bayesian inference framework. Then we extended our contributions to Gaussian mixtures with a new kind of variant of the OM algorithm, which guarantees the theoretical monotonicity of the penalized log likelihood. And then we went beyond Gaussian models and closed the loop by also addressing the nestedness issue in subspace learning we presented in introduction. So many perspectives arise from this work. Maybe the first one that came out with discussions with many statisticians is the extension of our framework to high dimensions. So our results, they are based on asymptotic frameworks where the dimension is fixed and the number of samples goes to infinity. And usually with the deep learning era, people are more and more interested in high dimensional settings where both the dimension and the number of samples is large. And you have a whole theory, like random matrix theory behind that, with a lot of strange phenomena like eigenvalue spreading. So we could take into account these results to extend our framework to high dimensions. We could also investigate the application of principal subspace analysis more in depth in joint work with applied scientists. Notably, we believe that in climate science, it could readily have an impact because it is expected to have some eigenvalues that are multiple in this field. And with slight modification of our model, we could also investigate spectral shape analysis and independent subspace analysis. Also, it would be interesting to study the geometric structure of the model selection problem for the choice of multiplicities, and it will involve the stratification of symmetric matrices by the multiplicities of the eigenvalues. And plenty of other perspectives arise, like having robust methods with using elliptical distributions, going from linear flags to non-linear flags by working, for instance, in tangent spaces of some manifolds or in latent spaces of deep generative models, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so the contribution of the thesis resulted in the following papers. The curse of isotropy is currently under second round of review for the statistical journal Statistical Science. The extension to Gaussian mixtures, it's a joint work with Pierre-Alexandre Mattei and Charles Bouveron. It is in second round for Statistics and Computing. The extension beyond Gaussian models is currently in revision for the Journal of Machine Learning Research. The extension of Minka's criterion to principal subspaces is joint work with Pierre-Alexandre Mattei, and we are expecting to submit it to Bayesian analysis. And also, so we have this continuous relaxation of the choice of multiplicities, and it was published in the conference Geometric Science of Information and nominated for the Best Paper Award. And then we have also this computation of the geodesic distance between two flags, which has been published in GSI 23. So I hope you are now convinced that flags can have a real impact in statistics. I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to have your questions. Thanks.